March 1, 1953. Inside a snow-covered dacha outside Moscow, the most feared man in the Soviet Union lies helpless on his study floor, surrounded by scattered papers and shattered glass. This was no ordinary collapse. It was the unraveling of an empire built on fear, where even a cry for help could mean death. For nearly 18 hours, no one dares enter his private quarters. Guards stand paralyzed. His inner circle debates in whispers. The man who controlled 200 million lives cannot control his own body. This is the story of how Joseph Stalin, architect of purges that killed millions, builder of the Soviet Empire, defeater of Nazi Germany, met his end in the most undignified circumstances imaginable. His final day reveals a truth more devastating than any execution he ordered: that absolute power, built on absolute terror, ultimately consumes itself. But to understand this extraordinary collapse, we must first examine the twisted world Stalin had created around himself. A world where fear was the only currency and loyalty was measured in blood. This is a tale of power, betrayal, and a fall that changed history. The Fortress of Fear. The Koncevo dacha stood like a monument to paranoia 20 kilometers southwest of Moscow. Behind multiple security perimeters and layers of armed guards, Stalin had built more than a residence. He had constructed a physical manifestation of his psychological state. Every room was monitored, every conversation potentially recorded, every visitor scrutinized, catalogued, and watched. By 1953, Stalin was 74 years old, and the weight of nearly 3 decades of absolute rule showed in every aspect of his daily routine. The man who had once worked through the night reshaping the Soviet Union now spent his evenings watching films and hosting dinner parties that stretched until dawn. These weren't social gatherings. They were elaborate performances of power, carefully choreographed displays of dominance and submission. The dacha's interior reflected Stalin's complex relationship with luxury and image. Georgian wines filled crystal glasses while portraits of Lenin gazed down from ornate walls. The contradiction was deliberate. Stalin presented himself as a simple man of the people while surrounding himself with the trappings of absolute authority. Every detail was calculated to reinforce his mythology while reminding visitors of their precarious position in his world. Stalin's daily routine had become increasingly erratic and nocturnal. He would often conduct important state business after midnight, forcing his subordinates to adjust their lives around his preferences regardless of the personal cost. Ministers and generals learned to nap in their offices, knowing they might be summoned to the dacha at any hour. This wasn't mere eccentricity, it was another tool of control, a way to keep his lieutenants off balance and dependent on his whims. The household staff at Koncevo operated under rules that bordered on the absurd. Servants were forbidden to make eye contact with Stalin. They were required to move through the residence in complete silence during certain hours. Even the gardeners were subject to security protocols that treated them as potential assassins rather than employees. The atmosphere was so oppressive that many staff members suffered from what would now be recognized as chronic anxiety and stress-related disorders. The security apparatus surrounding Stalin had evolved into something approaching a prison system, with the dictator as both warden and prisoner. Multiple layers of guards, each watching the others, created an environment where trust was impossible and paranoia was rational. Stalin had become so isolated by his own security measures that he had lost meaningful contact with reality outside his carefully controlled sphere. This isolation would prove fatal. The very systems designed to protect Stalin from his enemies would prevent anyone from helping him when he needed it most. The fortress of fear he had constructed would become his tomb. The Last Supper. February 28, 1953. The dining room at Koncevo hosted what would become Stalin's final dinner party. The guest list read like a roster of the Soviet Union's most dangerous men. Lavrentiy Beria, the sinister chief of the secret police whose spectacles concealed eyes that had witnessed unspeakable horrors. Georgy Malenkov, the pale administrator many believed was Stalin's chosen successor. Nikita Khrushchev, the Ukrainian peasant who had clawed his way to power through cunning and ruthlessness. Nikolai Bulganin, the former furniture worker who now served as deputy premier. Each man carried invisible blood on his hands. They had signed death warrants, overseen mass deportations, and eliminated rivals without hesitation. Yet, in Stalin's presence, they were reduced to nervous courtiers competing for favor while plotting their own survival. The dinner table became a theater of terror where a misplaced word or inappropriate laugh could seal one's fate. The evening followed a familiar pattern that had developed over years of these gatherings. Stalin dominated conversation while his guests performed careful choreographies of agreement and laughter. They praised his wisdom, applauded his observations, and competed to demonstrate their loyalty and usefulness. The performance was exhausting for everyone involved, but the consequences of a poor showing could be fatal. Stalin seemed unusually animated that evening, regaling his guests with stories from the Great Patriotic War and reminiscing about the revolution. He spoke at length about his achievements, the defeat of Nazi Germany, the rapid industrialization of the Soviet Union, the creation of a nuclear arsenal. Every accomplishment was presented as evidence of his indispensability, a none too subtle reminder to his subordinates of their dependence on his leadership. The conversation revealed the peculiar mixture of grandiosity and pettiness that characterized Stalin's personality. He would discuss grand strategy one moment and petty personal grievances the next. His guests had learned to navigate these sudden shifts in tone and topic, understanding that their survival depended on reading his mood correctly and responding appropriately. The film screening that followed dinner was typical of Stalin's entertainment preferences, a Soviet production glorifying the achievements of the revolution. Stalin provided running commentary, analyzing each scene for its political effectiveness and critiquing the portrayal of historical figures. His guests listened intently, knowing that their responses would be noted and potentially used against them later. The evening's entertainment extended well past midnight, as was customary. Stalin's nocturnal schedule had become legendary within the Soviet leadership, forcing his subordinates to adapt their lives to accommodate his preferences. Ministers would nap in their offices, generals would reschedule military exercises, and party officials would postpone important meetings, all to be available when Stalin decided to conduct business. Around 4 a.m. on March 1st, Stalin finally dismissed his guests. The ritual of departure was as carefully choreographed as everything else in his presence. Each man approached individually, expressed gratitude for his hospitality, and reaffirmed their loyalty. Stalin accepted these declarations with the casual arrogance of a man accustomed to absolute deference. As the black sedans carried his lieutenants back to Moscow through the pre-dawn darkness, none of them could have imagined they had just witnessed the end of an era. The man who had shaped their world through fear and violence would soon be reduced to a helpless figure lying in his own waste, abandoned by the very system he had created. The silence. March 1st dawned cold and clear at the Koncevo dacha. Snow covered the carefully manicured grounds, creating a deceptively peaceful scene that masked the tension building within the residence. The household staff went about their morning routines with practiced efficiency, moving silently through corridors and rooms while their master slept. Stalin's personal valet, Mikhail Butasov, had served the dictator for nearly a decade. He had learned to interpret Stalin's moods with remarkable accuracy, understanding when to provide service and when to remain invisible. The complete absence of any sounds from Stalin's private quarters was unprecedented and deeply troubling. No footsteps, no running water, no calls for assistance, just absolute silence. As the hours passed, Butasov's anxiety grew. Stalin's routine was rigid and predictable. Even when ill, there were always sounds of movement, requests for tea or summons for staff. The current silence was unlike anything the valet had experienced during his years of service. Butasov faced an impossible dilemma. Stalin had given explicit orders that he was never to be disturbed during his rest periods. The consequences of violating this rule could be severe, potentially fatal. Previous servants who had awakened Stalin prematurely had faced imprisonment, exile, or worse. The dictator's paranoia had reached such heights that even loyal attendants lived in constant fear of making a mistake that could be interpreted as sabotage. The valet paced nervously outside Stalin's suite, torn between duty and terror. Should he check on his master's welfare? Should he wait for some sign of activity? The weight of the decision pressed down on him like a physical force. He understood that his life hung in the balance. He might be condemned for showing too much concern, or blamed for failing to act when action was needed. Other household staff began to notice the unusual situation. The cook, who had prepared Stalin's meals for 15 years, expressed concern about the day's menu preparations. She had received no instructions about dietary preferences, which was highly unusual given Stalin's specific requirements and insistence on approving all changes in advance. Whispered conversations began among the staff, but no one dared voice their growing suspicion that something was seriously wrong. The atmosphere of fear was so pervasive that even discussing Stalin's absence felt dangerous. They had been conditioned to treat any deviation from routine as potentially suspicious, possibly treasonous. The head of security was informed of the situation, but he too found himself paralyzed by rigid protocols. Stalin's orders regarding privacy were absolute. No one was permitted to enter his quarters without explicit permission, regardless of circumstances. The security chief understood that making the wrong decision could result in his own destruction. As afternoon turned to evening, the tension at the dacha became almost unbearable. Nearly 18 hours had passed since Stalin had dismissed his dinner guests, and still no sound came from his private study. The staff moved about their duties like ghosts, their anxiety growing with each passing hour. The cruel irony was not lost on those who understood the situation. Here was the most powerful man in the Soviet Union, potentially lying helpless and alone, while his terrified servants stood outside his door too afraid to render aid. The system of terror Stalin had created to maintain power had become the instrument of his isolation in his moment of greatest need. The discovery. At approximately 6:30 p.m. on March 1st, nearly 20 hours after Stalin had been last seen, his valet finally summoned the courage to enter the dictator's private quarters. What Mikhail Butasov discovered would haunt him for the rest of his life and expose the moral bankruptcy that had consumed Stalin's empire. The door to Stalin's study opened with a soft creak that seemed to echo through the silent dacha. Butasov stepped cautiously into the room, his heart pounding with fear and anticipation. Heavy curtains cast the room in deep shadows, making it difficult to see clearly. The familiar scent of Stalin's tobacco mixed with something else, something wrong and unsettling. The scene that greeted the valet was one of complete helplessness and humiliation. Stalin lay sprawled on the floor near his desk, his body contorted in an unnatural position. He had clearly been there for many hours, possibly since the early morning. His clothing was soiled, his face pale and drawn, his breathing labored and irregular. The great dictator had been reduced to a pathetic figure lying in his own waste. The study told the story of Stalin's collapse. Papers were scattered across the floor, suggesting he had been working when the stroke occurred. A glass lay shattered nearby, its contents long evaporated. His desk chair was overturned, indicating the violence of his fall. The scene painted a picture of sudden, catastrophic medical emergency. Butasov's first instinct was to call for help, but even in this moment of crisis, the paralyzing fear that governed life in Stalin's household asserted itself. He stood frozen, unsure what to do or whom to contact. The established protocols provided no guidance for this unprecedented situation. Stalin himself had created a system so rigid and fear-based that it offered no mechanism for dealing with his own incapacitation. The valet's mind raced through possible consequences. If he called for help and Stalin recovered, would he be punished for violating privacy? If he failed to act and Stalin died, would he be blamed for negligence? The system of terror had turned every decision into a potential death sentence. After several minutes of paralysis, Butasov decided to contact the head of security. Colonel Ivan Krustalev arrived within minutes, took one look at the scene, and immediately grasped the gravity of the situation. However, like the valet, he found himself unable to move beyond the rigid protocols that had governed his career. The two men stood over their fallen leader, debating their next move in hushed, urgent tones. Should they call a doctor immediately? Should they contact Stalin's political allies first? Should they attempt to move him to a more dignified position? Each option carried enormous risks and potential consequences. Their conversation revealed the depths of psychological damage that Stalin's reign had inflicted on those around him. These were not cowards or incompetents, but men who had been so thoroughly terrorized that they could not trust their own judgment even in a clear medical emergency. The system had stripped them of basic humanity and capacity for independent thought. As they debated, Stalin's condition continued to deteriorate. His breathing became more shallow, his skin grew paler, and his body temperature began to drop. The delay in seeking medical attention was literally killing him, but the two men seemed paralyzed by the enormity of the decision they faced. Finally, the security chief decided to contact Beria, reasoning that the secret police chief would know how to handle such a delicate situation. The call was made, and within an hour, Beria arrived at the dacha accompanied by Malenkov. The gathering started. When Lavrentiy Beria and Georgy Malenkov arrived at the Koncevo dacha, their faces reflected both concern and calculation. They had clearly discussed the situation during their journey, understanding that Stalin's incapacitation represented both danger and opportunity. The two most powerful men in the Soviet hierarchy after Stalin now stood over their helpless leader, beginning a deadly game of political chess. Beria's first words upon seeing Stalin were not expressions of concern for his health, but questions about who else knew about the situation. His immediate priority was damage control and information management. The secret police chief understood that controlling the narrative around Stalin's illness would be crucial for maintaining stability and positioning himself for the inevitable power struggle. Malenkov began asking practical questions about the timeline of events. When had Stalin been last seen? Who had discovered him? Had any doctors been called? His administrative mind was already working through procedures that would need to be followed and decisions that would need to be made. The discussion that followed was conducted in whispers, with frequent glances toward the fallen dictator. Beria argued for limiting the number of people who knew about Stalin's condition. Malenkov agreed, suggesting they should carefully control information until they could determine the best course of action. The decision to delay calling for medical assistance was made with chilling calculation. The men reasoned that Stalin's condition appeared stable despite his obvious distress. They convinced themselves that a few more hours would not make a significant difference in his recovery, but could provide valuable time to prepare for the political upheaval that would inevitably follow. Messages were sent to Khrushchev and Bulganin, summoning them to the dacha under the pretext of an urgent meeting. The true nature of Stalin's condition was not revealed, only that their immediate presence was required. This deliberate ambiguity allowed Beria and Malenkov to control the narrative and manage their colleagues' reactions. When Khrushchev arrived, his initial shock quickly gave way to political calculation. His years of experience in Soviet politics had taught him to think strategically even in moments of crisis. He began to assess his own position in the coming power struggle while maintaining an appearance of concern for Stalin's welfare. Bulganin's arrival completed the gathering of Stalin's core leadership team. The four men now stood over their fallen leader, each lost in thoughts about the future. The conversation that followed was a masterclass in political maneuvering, with each participant carefully weighing words and actions. The debate centered on two critical questions: when to call for medical assistance, and how to manage information about Stalin's condition. Beria argued forcefully for maintaining secrecy until they could better assess the situation. Khrushchev began expressing concerns about the delay in seeking medical care, positioning himself as someone who put principle above personal gain. The grotesque irony was not lost on any of the participants. Here they were, debating the fate of the Soviet Union while their leader lay helpless and soiled on the floor of his own study. The man who had terrorized millions was now completely dependent on subordinates who had every reason to wish him dead. As the night wore on, the conversation shifted toward more practical matters. What would happen if Stalin died? Who would succeed him? How would they maintain control of the vast Soviet empire? These questions had been unthinkable just days earlier, but now they demanded immediate attention. Tentative alliances began to form. Beria and Malenkov seemed to be coordinating positions while Khrushchev and Bulganin developed their own understanding. But even as they planned for Stalin's potential death, the dictator continued to cling to life, his labored breathing a constant reminder of the precarious nature of their situation. Medical farce. It was not until the early hours of March 2nd, nearly 24 hours after Stalin's collapse, that his lieutenants finally agreed to summon medical assistance. The delay was not due to any lack of available doctors, but rather to political calculations and personal fears that had paralyzed the inner circle. Even the decision to call for medical help became another source of controversy. Stalin's paranoia had extended to the medical profession, and in his final years, he had become convinced that doctors were plotting against him. Just months earlier, he had launched the Doctor's Plot, a paranoid campaign targeting Jewish physicians whom he believed were conspiring to eliminate Soviet leaders. Many of the country's most skilled medical professionals had been arrested, imprisoned, or executed. The surviving doctors lived in constant fear of being accused of sabotage or murder. This atmosphere of terror had devastating consequences when Stalin himself needed medical care. The doctors who were summoned to treat Stalin were terrified of making any decision that could later be interpreted as deliberate harm. They understood that if Stalin died under their care, they would likely be blamed and face execution themselves. The paranoid system Stalin had created was now preventing him from receiving proper medical treatment. The medical team that finally arrived at the dacha was led by Professor Lukomsky, one of the few prominent physicians who had survived Stalin's recent purges. Lukomsky was skilled, but he was also a man haunted by the knowledge that his profession had become a target of the dictator's paranoid delusions. When the doctors entered Stalin's study, they found a scene of shocking degradation. The leader of the Soviet Union had been lying in his own waste for more than a day, his condition deteriorating with each passing hour. The delay in seeking medical care had almost certainly worsened his prognosis and increased his suffering. The initial examination revealed that Stalin had suffered a massive stroke. The damage to his brain was extensive and his condition was critical. However, the doctors were reluctant to make definitive statements about his prognosis, knowing that delivering bad news could be interpreted as sabotage. The medical team faced an impossible situation. They needed to provide treatment for their patient while protecting themselves from political consequences. Every decision could potentially be scrutinized later and used as evidence of incompetence or malicious intent. The doctors began administering basic care, cleaning Stalin and attempting to make him comfortable. However, their treatment options were limited by both the severity of his condition and their own fears. They were afraid to administer certain medications or procedures that might be necessary, knowing they would be blamed if Stalin died regardless of medical justification. As the doctors worked, Stalin's political allies watched their every move with suspicious eyes. Each medical decision was questioned and debated, creating an atmosphere of tension that made effective treatment nearly impossible. The physicians found themselves treating not just a patient with severe stroke, but navigating a minefield of political intrigue and personal danger. The irony was profound and tragic. Stalin's paranoid persecution of doctors had created a situation where the medical professionals who might have saved his life were too terrified to provide optimal care. The system of terror he had created had turned against him in his moment of greatest vulnerability. The Death Watch. Throughout March 2nd and into March 3rd, Stalin's condition continued to deteriorate. His breathing became increasingly labored, his responses less frequent. The man who had controlled the fate of millions was slipping away, surrounded by people who feared him even as he lay dying. The atmosphere at the dacha became increasingly surreal. Political allies continued whispered conversations about the future while doctors moved quietly around the dying dictator. Household staff went about duties with mechanical precision, still too frightened to show emotion about the unfolding tragedy. Stalin's physical decline was matched by the gradual disintegration of the fear-based system that had held the Soviet Union together. His subordinates began to speak more freely among themselves, though still in hushed tones. The iron grip of terror that had defined their lives for decades was slowly loosening. Beria began to assert himself more aggressively as Stalin's condition worsened. He started issuing orders to security staff and making decisions about access to the dacha. His actions revealed his expectation that he would play a major role in the post-Stalin government, and he was already positioning himself for the coming power struggle. Khrushchev watched these developments with growing concern. He understood that Beria's control of the secret police apparatus made him the most dangerous potential successor. The Ukrainian began thinking carefully about how to counter Beria's influence while protecting his own position. The doctors continued their vigil, monitoring Stalin's vital signs and providing what comfort they could. However, their role had essentially become that of witnesses rather than healers. They documented the dictator's decline with clinical precision, knowing their notes would likely be scrutinized for evidence of negligence or malicious intent. As hours passed, Stalin's breathing became increasingly irregular. His face, once so feared throughout the Soviet Union, had become pale and drawn. The powerful jaw that had delivered countless death sentences was now slack and helpless. The eyes that had struck terror into millions were now unfocused and distant. The transformation was complete and devastating. The man who had shaped the destiny of the Soviet Union through sheer force of will and brutality was now reduced to a failing biological organism dependent on others for his most basic needs. The contrast between his former power and current helplessness was stark and sobering. Family members were eventually summoned to the dacha. Stalin's daughter Svetlana and son Vasily arrived to find their father in his final hours. Their presence added another layer of complexity to an already tense situation, as political considerations mixed with personal grief in the charged atmosphere of the death chamber. The final vigil continued through the night of March 4th and into March 5th. The most powerful man in the Soviet Union was dying slowly, painfully, and without dignity. A fitting end for a life that had caused so much suffering to others. The end of terror. At approximately 9:50 p.m. on March 5, 1953, Joseph Stalin drew his final breath. The man who had ruled the Soviet Union with an iron fist for nearly 3 decades was dead. His passing was noted clinically by attending physicians who carefully recorded the time and circumstances of his death. The immediate reaction of those present was a mixture of relief, uncertainty, and carefully controlled emotion. No one dared celebrate openly, but there was a palpable sense that an era had ended. The fear that had dominated their lives was beginning to lift, replaced by anxiety about an uncertain future. Beria was the first to speak after Stalin's death was confirmed. He immediately began issuing orders about securing the dacha and controlling information about Stalin's passing. His actions revealed that he had been planning for this moment and was ready to move quickly to consolidate power. The news of Stalin's death would soon spread throughout the Soviet Union and around the world, triggering a period of uncertainty and change that would reshape the communist empire. Mass demonstrations of grief would fill Red Square as millions mourned a leader many genuinely believed had been their protector and guide. But for now, in the quiet of the Kontsevo dacha, the man who had terrorized millions had finally met his end in the most human and humbling way possible. The dictator who had seemed invincible had been defeated by his own body, abandoned by the system he had created, and reduced to a helpless figure dependent on the mercy of those he had brutalized. The preparations for Stalin's funeral began immediately, transforming his undignified death into a grand spectacle of state mourning. His body would lie in state in the Hall of Columns, viewed by hundreds of thousands of Soviet citizens who had been taught to revere him as a near-divine figure. The official narrative of Stalin's final hours would bear little resemblance to the reality of his lonely, humiliating death. Soviet propaganda would speak of a peaceful passing surrounded by loyal comrades, not the terrified paralysis and calculated delays that had marked his actual final day. The power struggle that followed Stalin's death would consume the Soviet leadership for months. Beria, despite his early maneuvering, would be arrested and executed within months by his former allies who feared his control of the secret police. Khrushchev would eventually emerge as the dominant figure, beginning the process of de-Stalinization that would reshape Soviet society. Stalin's death marked both an ending and a beginning. It closed the darkest chapter of Soviet history while beginning a long process of reckoning with his legacy. The man who seemed to control everything, nations, history, millions of lives, could not control his own mortality or the hearts of those around him. His brutal final hours serve as a timeless warning. Systems built on fear and violence ultimately consume themselves and their creators. In death, Stalin was reduced to what he had always been beneath the mythology. Simply a man as vulnerable as any of the millions whose lives he had destroyed.